And the final funnel is going to be a webinar funnel. Now, there's a few ways that you can do a webinar funnel. There are live webinars and there are auto webinars. Live webinars meaning that you do a live launch once a month, once every 2 weeks, depending on your audience size and your traffic, and you get everybody there for a specific date where you do it live. And then obviously auto webinar would be where you record it beforehand and people can opt in at any time, watch the full webinar and buy your stuff. There's pros and cons to each. Typically what I will do is I will start a webinar live, and that way I can really refine the entire webinar script in the process. And then eventually I almost always turn it auto, because for me, once again, I want to build a business that serves me instead of me serving it. So even if I could eke out an additional 2 or 3%, which is a lot in a webinar conversion, I would rather not have to get on a webinar every 2 weeks and kind of dance like a monkey for a little bit. I'd rather just have it running in the background and just see, $2,000, $4,000 payments hit overnight while I'm sleeping. For the structure of the webinar funnel, you'll always have an opt-in page. This is going to be very similar to the opt-in page that we talked about in the video sales letter funnel. You're collecting name, email, phone number. Then about, 15% all the way up to 50% of people can go from the opt-in page over to the webinar page. Now, why does the webinar opt-in have a higher potential opt-in rate than the video sales letter one? Well, because typically most video sales letters are direct, meaning they are saying something like, hey, opt in if you want to learn how you can work with me. And so those are going to be a lower conversion rate because not as many people want to work with you, where almost all webinars are indirect, where you're saying, hey, learn this cool and crazy new thing that you didn't know you needed before, but you definitely need. And so because they think they're going to learn this thing only and maybe not be sold to, or even if they do know they're going to be sold to, they're still interested enough, they're going to have more opt-ins for those people who are willing to learn what that thing is. Then, of course, you have the actual webinar page itself. Now, depending on if you're doing live or not live, you might send people to what's known as a webinar waiting room, which is typically where you're not going to show them the actual webinar itself. If you're doing it live, it's going to be a different page where you're going to say, hey, the webinar is in 1 day, 3 day, 5 days on this specific day. Make sure you mark your calendar, you do this other thing, blah, blah, blah. I'm not really going to cover that here because I think it would just be too much, but just know that some funnels, webinar funnels, if you're doing them live, instead of saying, hey, here's the webinar right away, you're going to say, hey, here's what you need to do to prepare yourself for the webinar that's going to be next week, essentially. And I have also tested when you're doing the webinar page itself, I've also tested like EverWebinar and all these different rooms and these fancy softwares where it like brings them all the way in. They can't exit out, blah, blah, blah. And honestly, I have found just keeping it in the same funnel on whatever funnel software you're working to be the best. It's typically simpler, which is almost always the best thing to do. And people kind of at this point know what webinars are. They're not thinking that your, auto webinar is a live webinar. You're trying to trick them, blah, blah, blah. So we've almost always found for conversion rate at higher scale of auto webinars, don't worry about the fancy webinar softwares. Literally just use whatever funnel software you're using, embed a video, and then have a button hidden below it that only shows up whenever you reach the pitch of the webinar itself. Webinars typically run anywhere from 60 minutes if you're selling something, let's say, for $500 to $1,000, all the way up to 90 minutes if you're selling something for $1,000 to $3,500. I have typically found $3,000 to $3,500 to be the upper limit of what you could sell on a auto webinar, and maybe $3,500 to $4,000 to be the upper limit of what you could sell on a live webinar. And then of course you have another format, which is challenges, where it's like multiple days. And that's where you can get into the multiple 5 figures of a product. But of course you're spending, 6 or 8 hours with that person over 3 to 6 days. And so you're getting more exposure from them in order to ask for that larger amount. Of the people that land on the webinar page and watch it long enough to see the button pop up below and click on it, that's typically going to be, let's say, about 20% of people that will go from the webinar page to the actual checkout page. And that's just going to be a condensed version, very similar to what the low ticket checkout page looks like. Because remember, the low ticket checkout page was acting like we were selling something for $700 or a couple of $1,000s. And so here we really are selling something for $1,000 to $3,500. And so that's typically going to be about 20% of people, and it has a recap of everything there. And then on the checkout page, those that actually purchase, you're typically going to see like 30% to 50%. Once again, these numbers vary greatly. Don't come attack me in the comments. Of people that land on the checkout page that actually purchase your high ticket product or service, which gets you a pretty much end-to-end funnel conversion rate anywhere from 2% to 5%. And you're going to be on the higher end, typically even as high as 8%, 10% if you're doing it live to a very warm audience. And you'll be on the lower then typically 2%, 3% if you're doing it cold and you're doing it on an auto webinar.
If you want my help installing any of these systems in your business done for you, be sure to book a call with my team down below.